The sun fell slow over Copper Ridge that evening, bleeding rust and gold across a sky too wide to trust. Dust hung in the air like powdered bone, settling over the crooked roofs and weathered porches where decent folk gathered to watch the madman haul his timber toward damnation. Silas Mercer moved through their stairs the way wind moves through canyon stone, silent, persistent, wearing down nothing but himself. His wagon creaked under the weight of fresh-cut pine, each plank chosen with a carpenter's reverence, each nail counted twice. The mule knew the path without guidance now, 3 weeks of the same pilgrimage having worn a trail from the lumber yard to the mouth of the abandoned copper vein mine. The shaft gaped black against the hillside, a throat that had swallowed silver and men's ambitions 40 years prior, now swallowing only Silas and his incomprehensible purpose. "There goes our local prophet of the apocalypse," Sheriff Dutch Holloway announced from the saloon steps, loud enough for the words to carry. Laughter rippled through the men assembled there, the kind that feels like fellowship when you're on the inside of it. Silas heard but didn't turn. His shoulders carried the weight they always did, not just timber but the particular heaviness of being seen and found wanting. May Dalton stood in her doorway, fingers weighted with rings that caught the dying light. She was a handsome woman gone hard at the edges, her saloon the closest thing Copper Ridge had to a beating heart. "Shame what grief does to a man's reason," she said to no one in particular, though everyone heard. Evelyn wouldn't recognize what's become of him. The name hung in the air like smoke. Evelyn. Silas's hands tightened on the reins, knuckles going white against weathered leather, but he didn't speak her name aloud. He never did. That grief belonged to him alone, a coal he'd swallowed that still burned in his chest 2 years after the prairie fire took her, after he'd returned from town to find their cabin reduced to ash and blackened timber, her body a small, impossible shape in the ruins. He'd been buying supplies. He'd been safe in town while she burned. Never again he'd promised the scorched earth where he buried her. Never again caught unprepared. Children followed his wagon for a spell, the Bridger boys and the Miller girl, brave in their pack. One threw a stone that pinged off the wagon bed. Silas turned then, not in anger but with something worse, a gentleness that made the children suddenly ashamed. They scattered like quail, leaving only dust and the echo of their running feet. The boarding house showed him its back windows, curtains drawn against the sight of him. Mrs. Brennan had told him 3 weeks ago that there were no rooms available, would likely never be rooms available, her eyes sliding away from his like water off oiled canvas. He'd nodded, tipped his hat, taken his rejection with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything now. What was one more door closed when the only one that mattered had been burned to cinders? He worked until the light failed completely, until the first stars pierced through the darkening vault above. The mine entrance stood transformed now, reinforced with timber bracing that would have done a cathedral proud. These were not the panicked preparations of a madman but the methodical work of a craftsman who understood load-bearing weight, stress points, the mathematics of survival. Inside, the darkness had been pushed back 60 feet, candles casting pools of warm light across walls he'd shored up, shelves he'd built with dovetail precision, space he was carving from the indifferent earth. He descended the ladder he'd installed, leaving the judgment of Copper Ridge above. Down here the air tasted of cool stone and possibility. His tools hung in perfect order on pegs he'd driven into the rock face. Water barrels stood full, their contents checked and refreshed weekly. Dried goods lined the shelves in neat rows, beans, cornmeal, salt pork, coffee. Seeds in labeled jars, organized by planting season. Medical supplies in a wooden box Evelyn would have admired for its joinery. And on the small table he'd recently finished, where candlelight pooled like liquid amber, sat a pocket watch with her portrait inside. He opened it carefully, the way you handle holy things. Her face looked back at him, forever young, forever 2 days before the fire. The photographer had caught her mid-laugh, joy trapped in silver nitrate and glass. Silas touched the image with a fingertip calloused from honest work. "I'm building something that lasts," he told her, his voice barely a whisper in the close darkness. "Something fire can't take. Something ready for whatever comes." Above ground, the wind had begun to shift. It carried a strange charge, the kind old-timers recognized but rarely spoke of, the kind that made horses restless in their stalls and set dogs to whining. The sky had gone from gold to bruised purple, clouds gathering at the horizon like dark thoughts collecting into intention. In the saloon, men drank and laughed and called Silas Mercer crazy. In the boarding house, curtains twitched as May Dalton watched the mine entrance, something uncertain moving behind her practiced scorn. And in the deepening dark of the shaft, Silas hung his hat on a peg beside the ladder and lit another candle. The flame caught and held, a small defiant brightness against the vast indifference of stone. He had work to do yet, more bracing to install, more provisions to stock, more preparation against a disaster he couldn't name but felt approaching with the certainty of weather, with the terrible clarity of a man who'd learned that the world breaks suddenly, that everything you love can turn to ash while you're away buying nails. The wind above picked up, a low howl beginning in the canyon rocks. Down below, Silas began to build. She arrived on a Thursday when the dust devils were dancing in the street, a woman alone with a loom strapped to a mule and silence wrapped around her like a shawl. Iris Blackwood dismounted in front of the general store with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned not to expect welcome. Her fingers stained the deep blue of indigo dye, her black braids threaded with silver that caught the harsh noon light. She was perhaps 35, perhaps ageless, her Cherokee blood evident in the angle of her cheekbones and the directness of her gaze, a gaze that had learned to slide away before others could turn theirs first. The town received her with the particular stillness reserved for those who don't quite belong. Women gathered their skirts and children as if foreignness were contagious. Men appraised her with eyes that made calculations she'd long since stopped trying to prevent. May Dalton watched from her saloon window, cataloging. Widow's weeds, eastern saddle, quality loom, no ring, alone. The assessment took seconds, the judgment even less. "We don't have much call for weaving," Mrs. Brennan informed her coolly when Iris inquired about work, her meaning clear as spring water. "We don't have much call for you." Iris nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement rather than defeat, and found lodging at the edge of town in a shack that leaked when it rained and shuddered when the wind blew. The landlord, a thin man named Jessup with tobacco-stained teeth, quoted her twice the usual rate. She paid without haggling, knowing the cost of arguing when you had nowhere else to go. Market day came with its rituals of commerce and cruelty. Iris set up her wares on a makeshift table, blankets woven with patterns her mother had taught her, each one a prayer in textile form, sunset colors bleeding into night sky, geometric precision that spoke of discipline and beauty intertwined. The work was exquisite. The townsfolk examined it with suspicious eyes, turning over the fabric as if checking for hexes, offering insultingly low prices or simply walking away. Beside her, separated by 10 feet of dust and mutual isolation, Silas Mercer displayed a rocking chair he'd built from cherry wood. The joinery was flawless, each spindle turned with such precision it seemed more grown than made, the rockers curved in a way that understood the mathematics of comfort. No one would meet his eyes. No one would pay what it was worth. Iris noticed him the way you notice another survivor in a shipwreck, the recognition instant and wordless. She saw the careful distance people maintained, the way mothers pulled children close when he moved, the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being visible and ignored simultaneously. His hands bore the same calluses hers did, the evidence of work that mattered to no one but the maker. He noticed her noticing. Their eyes met across that small gulf of dusty street. Neither smiled. Neither looked away. It was enough. The afternoon turned cruel when Jim Holloway, the sheriff's nephew, stumbled from the saloon with liquor making him brave and stupid. He lurched toward Iris's table, leering, and with a sweep of his arm sent her blankets tumbling into the dirt. "Squaw work," he announced to the gathered crowd, the slur landing like a fist. "Probably cursed anyway." Laughter erupted from the saloon steps. May Dalton didn't laugh but didn't stop it either, her silence its own kind of violence. Iris knelt immediately, gathering her work with steady hands that refused to tremble. Dust clung to the fibers she'd spent months perfecting. A boot print marked the corner of her finest piece. She folded each blanket with deliberate care, her face a mask of the dignity that's harder to maintain than anger, more exhausting than tears. Then Silas was kneeling beside her, his large carpenter's hands gently lifting a blanket the color of twilight. He brushed the dust away with a tenderness usually reserved for wounded things, folded it along its natural lines, placed it on her table with the reverence it deserved. Neither spoke. The crowd watched, confused by this alliance of the unwanted, unsure whether to escalate or retreat. Jim Holloway spat in the dirt between them and staggered away. The moment passed. The market resumed its transactions, and Silas returned to his rocking chair, and Iris finished repacking her blankets, but something had shifted in the architecture of their separate solitudes. That evening, as purple dusk settled over Copper Ridge, Iris found a small wooden shuttle waiting at her door. It was carved from pale ash, perfectly balanced, sized precisely for her loom with a maker's understanding of how the tool must fit the hand. No note accompanied it. None was needed. She held it to the fading light, saw the grain he'd followed, the hours of patient shaping, the gift that said, "I see your work and it matters." 3 days later she walked to the mine entrance at sunset. Silas was there, preparing to descend, and he startled at her approach like a man unaccustomed to being sought. She held out a folded cloth, deep indigo shot through with silver thread that caught the dying light like stars emerging. The pattern showed a sky in transition, day surrendering to night, the liminal beauty of change. "For the table you're building down there," she said, her first words to him, her voice carrying the particular music of someone who'd learned English as a second language and made it sing differently. He took it with both hands, holding it as if it might dissolve. His throat worked. His eyes, when they met hers, held a question he didn't know how to ask. "I know what it is," she said quietly, "to build a place the world can't burn." Then she turned and walked back toward her leaking shack, leaving him standing in the gathering dark with her weaving pressed against his chest like a benediction, like a promise, like the beginning of something neither had dared hope for, the simple, revolutionary act of being understood. The sky began changing in early June, taking on a quality that made horses refuse their stalls and old men study the horizon with narrowed eyes. The heat pressed down like a hand, oppressive and waiting, the air thick enough to chew. Clouds gathered at the edge of the world each evening, bruised purple and green, then dissolved without rain, leaving only the copper taste of electricity and unease. Silas worked faster now, driven by an urgency he couldn't articulate but felt in his bones. The mine shaft extended deeper, the bracing more elaborate, provisions stocked with increasing intensity. People noticed his acceleration and mistook desperation for madness, shaking their heads as he hauled barrel after barrel of water into the earth's mouth. Dutch Holloway organized the town's storm preparations with methodical efficiency. Cellars checked, shutters reinforced, livestock secured. Copper Ridge had weathered prairie storms before, violent but passing. "That lunatic's building an ark for a rain that ain't coming," Tom Bridger announced at the saloon, and the men laughed into their whiskey, secure in their collective sanity. But the atmosphere knew something they didn't. Birds flew in confused patterns. The wind smelled wrong. And on the 4th of June, Jessup appeared at Iris's shack with eviction in his eyes and cruelty in his smile. "Need the space for storage," he said, though they both knew he simply wanted her gone, this strange woman with her loom and her silence and her refusal to disappear. "You got 3 days." She packed her belongings without protest, her hands steady as they folded her life into manageable bundles. The boarding house refused her before she reached the door. May Dalton suggested she try the reservation with a smile sharp as broken glass, enjoying the power of having something someone needed. The church offered prayers but no shelter. Copper Ridge had made its position clear. She could exist within it but would never belong to it. Sunset found her sitting on her bundled possessions outside the condemned shack, her loom beside her like a loyal animal with nowhere left to go. She wasn't crying. Crying required the belief that someone might care, and Iris had long since released that particular illusion. She simply sat, calculating distances to the next town, counting coins she didn't have, planning a departure she lacked the means to execute. Silas appeared as the light failed, materializing from the dusk like something summoned by need rather than chance. He stood before her, hat in his hands, turning it slowly as he gathered words that didn't come easily. "I have space," he finally said, each syllable deliberate. "Below ground. It's not proper but it's safe. Dry. And there's room for your loom." The offer hung between them, weighted with implications. A man and a woman, unmarried, living together in a hole in the earth. The scandal would be absolute, the judgment crushing. Iris studied his face, reading the sincerity there, the bone-deep loneliness that matched her own, the quiet desperation of someone offering the only thing he had. "I'll keep to my corner," she said finally. "I'll keep to mine," he agreed. A pause stretched, filled with the sound of wind beginning its restless stirring. Then Iris smiled, barely, the expression transforming her features into something almost mischievous. "Until we don't want to anymore." Silas's ears reddened, but he nodded once, solemn as a vow. Together they loaded her belongings onto his wagon, the loom secured with rope, her bundles arranged with care, 2 lives converging toward a sanctuary built for one. The town watched them disappear into the mine shaft as darkness fell. May Dalton stood in her doorway, lips pursed in righteous disapproval. Mrs. Brennan clutched her Bible and muttered about Sodom. The men in the saloon speculated with crude enthusiasm about what might transpire in that underground darkness. Only young Clara Brennan, 15 and already tired of her mother's certainties, felt something like hope watching them vanish together into the earth. Inside the mine, candlelight transformed stone into cathedral. Iris descended the ladder behind Silas, her feet finding each rung, moving from the judgment of the surface world into this carved sanctuary. The space opened before her, 60 feet of careful excavation, timber-braced walls, shelves lined with provisions, water barrels catching the light, and in the center, the table he'd built, her indigo weaving spread across its surface like an altar cloth. "I'll build a partition," Silas said quickly, gesturing to the far corner. "For privacy. You'll have your own." "Tomorrow," Iris interrupted gently. "Build it tomorrow." They arranged her belongings in a careful silence, their movements developing a rhythm, a wordless choreography of shared space and mutual respect. Her loom fit perfectly in the alcove he'd unconsciously left empty, as if he'd been preparing for her arrival all along. Her cooking supplies nestled beside his. Her blankets folded near his bedroll, close enough for comfort, far enough for propriety. When everything was settled, they sat at the table, drinking coffee Silas brewed on the small ventilated stove he'd engineered. The silence between them was companionable now, the quiet of two people who'd learned that words often said less than presence. "Why?" Iris asked finally. "Why take me in when the town already thinks you mad?" Silas considered this, his scarred hands wrapped around the tin cup. "Because I know what it is to lose everything to fire," he said quietly. "And I know what it is to be alone with that loss. And I know that if Evelyn were here, she'd have opened our door to you without hesitation. So I did what she would have done because that's how I keep her alive." Outside, the wind picked up, no longer restless but purposeful, carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something vast and approaching. The barometric pressure began its inexorable fall. In town, shutters rattled and dogs howled, and the truly observant felt their ears pop with the change. But 60 feet below the surface, Silas and Iris sat in candlelight, refugees from a world that didn't want them, preparing without knowing it for the moment when that world would need them desperately, when the sky would open its furious mouth and teach Copper Ridge the difference between madness and vision. The sky turned wrong on the 12th of June, the color of infection, yellow-green and swollen with malice. The air died completely, that terrible stillness before nature screams, when even the insects go silent and the world holds its breath. Silas stood at the mine entrance at noon, reading the signs written in atmosphere and instinct, and knew with absolute certainty that his preparation was about to be tested. In town, the unease had crystallized into action. Dutch Holloway moved through the streets with urgent efficiency, checking cellars, calling families to shelter. May Dalton secured her cash box and liquor inventory, priorities revealing character. Tom Bridger wrestled his panicked horses toward the stable, their eyes rolling white with animal knowledge. Mrs. Brennan dragged Clara toward their storm cellar, Bible clutched in one hand, her daughter's wrist in the other. The horizon darkened, not gradually but with violent intention. The funnel cloud touched down 5 miles west, a finger of God pointing at the earth in terrible accusation. It carved a path through empty prairie, pulling grass and soil into its howling column, growing wider, darker, hungrier as it advanced. Silas descended the ladder quickly, his movements economical with urgency. Iris looked up from her loom, saw his face and understood immediately. No words were needed. She began securing loose items, her hands quick and certain, while he pulled the reinforced cover over the mine entrance. Timber and canvas weighted with sandbags, designed to deflect debris while allowing air to flow through carefully engineered vents. The roar began as a whisper, distant and insistent, then grew into something elemental, the sound of freight trains and fury combined, the voice of annihilation approaching at 60 miles per hour. Above ground, Copper Ridge scrambled for cover. Families huddled in cellars. The unprepared pressed themselves against interior walls and prayed to a God who seemed suddenly very far away. The tornado struck the town with the indifference of divine wrath. The church steeple ripped away first, spinning upward into the black column like a toy discarded by a petulant child. The boarding house exploded into splinters, Mrs. Brennan's careful propriety reduced to flying timber. May Dalton's saloon collapsed inward, the building folding like paper, her screams lost in the greater howling. Tom Bridger died pinned beneath the stable beam, his horses already gone, pulled screaming into the sky. Glass became shrapnel. Roofs peeled away like skin. The schoolhouse where Clara had learned her letters vanished completely, foundation stones the only evidence it had existed. Livestock tumbled through the air in grotesque flight, their bodies breaking against what remained standing. The tornado was a mile wide now, a wall of destruction that devoured Copper Ridge with methodical completeness, turning permanence into memory, certainty into ruin. In the jail cellar, Dutch Holloway braced the door with his body, shoulder dislocating from the pressure differential, teeth gritted against agony and terror. In the newspaper office foundation, Clara Brennan held her weeping mother, watching through a crack as their world unmade itself. In May Dalton's flooding cellar, the saloon keeper clung to a support beam and understood with sudden clarity that all her judgment, all her carefully maintained superiority, meant nothing against this. 60 feet below the surface, Silas and Iris felt the world end in muffled thunder. The earth itself trembled. Dust sifted from ceiling beams. The candles guttered in pressure changes that made their ears ache and pop. The sound above was ocean deep, apocalyptic, the roar of everything they'd feared given terrible voice. They sat together on the floor, backs against stone that had stood for millennia and would stand for millennia more. Evelyn's pocket watch rested between them, its ticking impossibly audible in the spaces between the roaring. Iris's hands worked automatically, her fingers moving through the familiar patterns of weaving even without thread, a prayer made physical, a meditation against terror. Silas reached out slowly as if the gesture might shatter something fragile and took her hand. Her fingers, stained with indigo and strong from years of tension and release, laced through his calloused palm. They fit together with the precision of his joinery, the intention of her weaving, two damaged pieces forming something whole. No words passed between them. Words would have been insufficient, presumptuous, too small for the moment. But in that contact, that simple joining of hands while the world above them died, entire conversations unfolded. Grief acknowledged. Loneliness witnessed. Survival chosen not as solitary defiance but as shared commitment. "We're going to live," Iris whispered finally, her voice barely audible beneath the cacophony. "We're going to live," Silas confirmed, and the promise was both prediction and prayer, both comfort and covenant. The tornado passed over them like the hand of death passing over marked doorways, finding nothing to claim in the deep earth. They felt its passage in the bone-shaking rumble, the pressure that made their lungs work harder, the way the candle flames bent sideways as if bowing to superior force. And then gradually the roar diminished. The freight train sound faded to wind, wind faded to an eerie, wounded silence. They waited in the candlelit dark, neither willing to release the other's hand. Minutes stretched. An hour passed. The silence above was somehow worse than the roaring had been, pregnant with unknown devastation, heavy with the weight of what they would find. Finally, as evening light began filtering through the ventilation shafts, Silas stood. He lit a lantern with steady hands, though his heart hammered against his ribs like something caged and desperate. Iris rose beside him, her indigo-stained fingers still wrapped through his. "We should see," he said quietly. Together, hand in hand, they climbed toward the surface, toward whatever remained of the world that had rejected them, carrying with them the water and supplies and shelter that world would desperately need, ascending from their sanctuary not in triumph but in terrible, gentle purpose, ready to offer grace to those who had offered none. They emerged into a landscape erased. Where Copper Ridge had stood, only foundations remained, geometric scars in muddy earth marking where lives had been built and unmade. The church bell lay half-buried 50 yards from its vanished steeple, tongue silenced. Trees stood naked and splintered, some driven into the ground like stakes marking graves. The air tasted of wet earth and shattered wood and that particular emptiness that follows catastrophe, the smell of ending. Survivors crawled from wreckage like insects from disturbed stones, bleeding and shocked, their faces masks of incomprehension. A woman wailed somewhere in the rubble. A child cried for a mother who might no longer answer. The town that had stood solid and certain that morning existed now only in memory, its arrogance leveled, its judgment rendered meaningless by wind. Silas stood at the mine entrance holding the lantern, and for one terrible moment felt vindication rise in his chest like bile, dark and bitter and satisfying. He'd been right. They'd been wrong. Every mocking word, every turned back, every stone thrown by children parroting their parents' cruelty, all of it proven foolish by nature's indifferent fury. Iris touched his arm, her fingers light but certain. She looked at him with eyes that understood the temptation toward bitterness, having tasted it herself many times. "They'll need shelter," she said quietly. The words hung between them, a choice crystallizing. He could close the mine entrance, secure what he'd built for himself, let the town that rejected him face the consequences of its blindness. Justice, some might call it. Karma. The natural order of cause and effect. Or he could become something else entirely. "We have it," he said, and the pronouncement felt like stepping off a cliff, like choosing grace when vengeance would be easier, like honoring Evelyn's memory in a way she would recognize. The first to find them was Clara Brennan, half carrying her limping father, his leg gashed and useless. She saw the mine entrance, saw Silas and Iris standing there whole and prepared, and something broke in her young face, relief and shame and desperate hope combined. The wildflowers she'd left weeks ago lay scattered by the entrance, their petals torn by wind. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible. Silas nodded once and helped them descend into safety. Then May Dalton appeared, her elegant dress shredded and mud-soaked, her rings lost, her carefully constructed superiority washed away by terror and rain. She stood before Silas unable to speak, tears cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. He extended his hand without a word and guided her down into the sanctuary she'd mocked. They came in twos and threes, then dozens, Dutch Holloway cradling his dislocated shoulder, the widow Patterson carrying her infant, the Milliken family with their youngest daughter unconscious from a head wound. Families who'd whispered about Silas's madness now descended his ladder into salvation. The mine shaft that had held two now swelled with 30 souls, bodies pressed close in the candlelit depths, the living and the grateful and the humbled. Silas moved through them with quiet efficiency, distributing water from his carefully hoarded barrels, sharing dried beef and hardtack, his provisions suddenly finding their purpose. Iris tore her beautiful weavings into bandages without hesitation, her indigo-stained fingers binding wounds with the same care she'd given to creating beauty. The sunset pattern she'd woven became tourniquets. The starlight cloth became slings. May Dalton wept as Iris wrapped her bleeding hands, the sound raw and broken. "I'm sorry," she whispered again and again, the words inadequate but necessary. "I'm so sorry." Iris met her eyes with a gaze clear of judgment. "We survive first," she said gently. "Everything else comes after." Dutch Holloway watched Silas splint young Tommy Bridger's broken arm with perfect carpenter's precision, watched him work with the same careful attention he brought to building furniture no one would buy, and shame colored the sheriff's weathered face. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. Silas didn't pause in his work, didn't gloat or lecture. "You were scared," he replied. "People mock what frightens them. I understand that now." Over the following days, as rescue parties arrived from neighboring towns, the mine became more than shelter, it became the heart of survival. Silas's ventilation system kept the air breathable. His water stores kept them hydrated. His organization kept panic at bay. The madman's lair revealed itself as the only sane response to an insane world, preparation mistaken for paranoia proven to be wisdom all along. But the true transformation unfolded in smaller moments. May Dalton asking Silas to teach her about structural reinforcement for the rebuilding. Dutch Holloway publicly apologizing, his voice breaking. Clara Brennan writing in her salvaged notebook about the man who saw what was coming and prepared room for everyone, even those who scorned him. 6 weeks after the tornado, Copper Ridge rose again from its foundations, humbler and wiser. The new town hall bore a plaque thanking Silas Mercer and Iris Blackwood for their service. The new storm shelters, designed by Silas, dotted the rebuilt streets. But these public acknowledgments mattered less than the private transformation in two hearts. They married in the rebuilt church on a September evening when the sky ran gold and gentle. The whole town attended not from obligation but gratitude and genuine joy. May Dalton wept openly. Clara threw wildflowers. Dutch Holloway stood as witness, his healed shoulder a reminder of grace received. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional. But when Silas placed Evelyn's pocket watch in a memorial box and closed it gently, honoring the past while choosing the future, the gesture transcended words. And when Iris wove their hands together with a cord she'd made, blue and silver, sunrise and starlight, the binding spoke of two solitudes becoming one shared sanctuary. They kissed while the congregation cheered, and in that moment the exile became essential, the mocked became beloved, and two people who'd built shelter against the world discovered they'd actually been building toward each other all along, brick by careful brick, thread by intentional thread, until the storm came and revealed what love looks like when it's tested by fire and wind and emerges not just intact but transformed into something stronger, something that shelters others, something that endures.